The leak started as a thin, steady drip beneath the kitchen sink in Margaret Collins' old blue house on the quiet streets of Portland, and by the time she called her daughter, the water had already begun to stain the wood beneath the cabinet floor. Emily Harper answered her phone at work, concern tightening her voice as her mother described the problem, and she quickly called her husband, Daniel. Daniel had always been the dependable one, the man who knew how to fix things with calm hands and steady patience. After finishing his shift at the hardware store, he drove through the gray Oregon drizzle toward his mother-in-law's home, not thinking of anything unusual, only that he needed to tighten a pipe and be back before dinner. The rain made the streets shine under the fading light, and as he pulled into the driveway, he noticed how quiet the house looked, almost too still for early evening. Margaret opened the door before he even knocked, relief softening her lined face. She had aged in small, quiet ways since her husband passed away 3 years earlier. The house once felt lively, filled with music and weekend laughter, but now it carried the heavy silence of one person living alone. Daniel stepped inside, wiping his boots carefully, greeting her with the easy kindness that had always defined their relationship. She thanked him more than once, almost too much, as if the broken pipe had been something far more serious. In the kitchen, he crouched beneath the sink, rolling up his sleeves while Margaret stood nearby holding a flashlight. The leak wasn't dramatic, just a worn seal and a loose connection, but water had been dripping for days. As Daniel worked, the sound of rain against the windows mixed with the quiet drip into the metal bowl Margaret had placed underneath. The simple repair should have taken only minutes, yet the stillness of the house made the moment stretch. Margaret tried to fill the silence with light conversation at first, asking about Emily's job, about business at the store, about the traffic downtown. Daniel answered politely, focused on tightening the fittings, but something in her voice shifted. There was a softness there, a hesitation, as though she had more to say. When the pipe finally stopped leaking and the drip faded into silence, Daniel felt a small sense of accomplishment, the simple satisfaction of fixing something broken. He stood up, brushing dust from his jeans, ready to gather his tools. That was when Margaret said, almost quickly, "Would you stay for a cup of coffee? It's still raining." It was an ordinary request, nothing strange, nothing inappropriate. He hesitated only a second before agreeing. The kitchen light felt warmer once they sat across from each other at the small wooden table. Margaret poured the coffee slowly, her hand steady but careful, and thanked him again, not just for fixing the pipe, but for coming so quickly. Daniel shrugged it off, saying that family helps family. Yet as they spoke, the conversation deepened in a way neither expected. Margaret mentioned how quiet the house felt in the evenings, how she sometimes turned on the television just to hear voices in the background. She spoke about her late husband with gentle affection, not dramatic grief, but the quiet ache of someone adjusting to an empty chair at the dinner table. Daniel listened with real attention, something he had not realized he missed giving or receiving. At home, life with Emily had become busy and structured. They loved each other, but their conversations often revolved around schedules, bills, and future plans. Sitting in that warm kitchen, Daniel felt the rare space to simply listen without rushing. Margaret noticed the tiredness in his eyes and asked if he was overworking himself. He gave a small smile and said work was just busy, though inside he knew his exhaustion wasn't only physical. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the windows in uneven rhythm, and the house felt smaller, more intimate, wrapped in the sound of the storm. Margaret's voice softened further as she admitted that asking for help had become harder since her husband passed. She didn't like feeling dependent. Daniel reassured her that she wasn't a burden, that he was glad to help. The words were simple, but the look she gave him lingered a moment longer than usual. It wasn't romantic or inappropriate, it was gratitude mixed with relief. Yet something subtle shifted in the air, something neither of them named. Daniel suddenly became aware of how alone she must feel in that house and, in a quiet corner of his heart, he recognized a loneliness in himself too, less obvious, less dramatic, but present. He had not come expecting anything beyond a quick repair, yet now he found himself staying longer, talking about small memories, about the early years of his marriage, about how quickly time seemed to move. Margaret listened with interest, asking thoughtful questions, giving him her full attention. When the rain began to slow, Daniel glanced at the clock and realized nearly an hour had passed. He stood, slightly surprised, and began packing his tools. Margaret walked him to the door, thanking him again, her voice warm but touched with something deeper, something like hope that the house might not feel so empty again soon. As Daniel stepped back into the damp evening air, he felt a strange pull in his chest. Nothing had happened. Nothing improper had been said or done. Yet he sensed that the visit had meant more than it should have. Driving home through the wet streets, windshield wipers moving steadily back and forth, he replayed the conversation in his mind. He told himself it was just kindness, just family helping family, but beneath that reasoning lingered a quiet awareness that emotional lines are not always bold and visible. Sometimes they blur slowly, like water spreading across wood before anyone notices the damage. And as he turned into his own driveway, he had no idea that this small act of fixing a leak would become the first step towards something far more complicated than a broken pipe. After that rainy evening, Daniel told himself the visit had meant nothing more than kindness, yet a week later when Margaret called about a flickering porch light, he offered to stop by without hesitation, and this time the sky was clear, the air crisp with early autumn wind, and the house looked less lonely in the sunlight, but inside it still carried that deep quiet that seemed to wrap around a person the moment they stepped through the door. Daniel fixed the light in minutes, yet again he found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, listening as Margaret spoke about small things that slowly turned into bigger ones, how mornings felt long, how she missed cooking for someone, how silence could feel heavier than noise, and Daniel listened in a way he had not listened to anyone in a long time, leaning forward, asking questions, giving her his full attention, and when she thanked him for simply being there, the words landed deeper than they should have. At home, Emily had been working late almost every night, her new marketing role demanding more hours than expected, and though she and Daniel still shared polite smiles and quick updates about their days, something soft between them had grown thin, like fabric stretched too far, and Daniel never blamed her, not out loud, but he carried a quiet sense of being unseen, a feeling he could not fully explain, so when Margaret asked how he was really doing, not in a casual way but with steady concern, he paused before answering, then admitted he felt tired, not just from work but from routine, from days that felt the same, from conversations that ended before they truly began, and Margaret nodded as if she understood every word without needing more detail. Their talks became regular after that, never planned, always simple excuses, a thermostat that needed checking, a cabinet hinge that squeaked, a smoke detector battery that chirped at night, and Daniel would drive over after work, telling himself he was helping family, telling himself there was no harm in offering support, yet each visit lasted longer than the repair required. They spoke about dreams once put aside, about how Margaret had once wanted to travel across Canada by train but never had the chance, about how Daniel had once imagined starting his own small renovation business but settled into the safe routine of the hardware store. And as they shared these thoughts, something began to grow, not passion, not romance in a dramatic sense, but a connection built on understanding and attention. One evening as orange leaves scattered across the front yard and the air turned colder, Daniel arrived to fix a loose gutter, and after finishing he stayed for dinner at Margaret's gentle insistence, nothing fancy, just homemade soup and warm bread, yet the act of sitting across from someone who looked at him with genuine interest stirred feelings he struggled to name. Margaret never crossed a clear line, never spoke disrespectfully about her daughter, never suggested anything inappropriate, but her eyes softened when she looked at Daniel, and her voice held a warmth that felt personal, and Daniel began to notice how comfortable he felt in that kitchen, how the quiet no longer seemed heavy but welcoming. Meanwhile at home, Emily noticed his later returns, though he explained them easily, traffic, extra shifts, helping her mother, and she trusted him without question, which somehow made Daniel's chest feel tighter. Not from guilt exactly but from awareness that he was stepping into emotional space that did not belong to him. The conversations at Margaret's house deepened, moving from simple updates to confessions of regret, of fear of aging alone, of wondering if life had passed too quickly, and Daniel found himself sharing more than he ever had, speaking about the distance he felt in his marriage without accusing anyone, speaking about the quiet dinners and distracted evenings, and Margaret listened without judgment, offering empathy instead of advice. One night the power briefly went out during a windstorm, and they sat in the dim glow of a single battery lantern, the house wrapped in shadow and soft silence, and Margaret said gently that sometimes people search for warmth wherever they can find it, not because they mean to hurt anyone but because they are afraid of being cold for too long, and Daniel felt those words settle inside him. When the lights flickered back on, neither of them spoke for a moment, both aware that something delicate stood between them, something unnamed yet understood. Daniel began to look forward to her calls, to the sound of her voice thanking him, to the way she asked about his day as if it truly mattered, and though he never touched her beyond a polite hug at the door, the emotional closeness grew stronger, built through shared vulnerability and quiet evenings. He started noticing small details, the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear when nervous, the careful way she set 2 cups on the table even before asking if he would stay. And these details stayed with him longer than they should have. He told himself it was compassion, that he was simply supporting a woman who had lost her husband, yet deep down he knew he was also seeking something for himself, something he had not addressed within his own marriage. One cool Friday evening, as wind rustled the trees outside and the house felt warmer than usual, Margaret reached across the table while thanking him for always showing up, and her fingers brushed against his hand, resting there for just a second longer than necessary, and though the gesture was small and gentle, it carried weight, not desire but acknowledgement, a silent admission that their connection had shifted beyond simple family support. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken, not with excitement but with clarity, realizing that emotional boundaries had slowly faded without either of them making a dramatic choice, and in that brief contact lay the truth: they were standing at the edge of something that could not continue without consequence. He pulled his hand back politely, offering a soft smile, yet the air between them had changed, filled with awareness neither could ignore, and as he drove home that night under a sky scattered with cold stars, he understood that what had begun as harmless conversations had grown into something far more fragile and dangerous, because infidelity does not always start with obvious betrayal. Sometimes it begins quietly, with 2 lonely hearts talking too honestly in a silent kitchen. After Margaret's hand lingered on his, Daniel knew a line had been crossed even though nothing dramatic had happened, and from that evening forward every visit carried a quiet tension that neither of them spoke about but both clearly felt. He tried to reduce his trips to the house, telling himself he needed distance, yet when Margaret called about a rattling heater as winter crept into Portland, he found himself driving over again, his thoughts heavy but his actions automatic, and the moment he stepped inside, the familiar warmth of her kitchen wrapped around him like comfort he had started to depend on. He fixed the heater quickly, tightening a loose panel and adjusting the thermostat, but instead of leaving, he stood there unsure, and Margaret watched him with calm, thoughtful eyes, as if waiting for him to decide who he wanted to be. They sat down without planning to, and the conversation moved fast, skipping small talk, diving straight into feelings that had been building for weeks, Margaret admitting that his visits had become the highlight of her days, Daniel confessing that he felt understood in a way he hadn't in a long time, and though neither used romantic words, the meaning hung clearly between them. Daniel spoke about the quiet in his marriage, about how he and Emily had become polite partners rather than passionate companions, about how schedules had replaced connection, and Margaret listened with empathy but also caution, reminding him gently that loneliness can distort judgment, yet her voice trembled slightly, revealing that she too felt the pull of their growing bond. Outside, wind shook the bare tree branches, and inside the house felt smaller, as if closing in on them, forcing them to face what was happening. Daniel stood and paced once, running a hand through his hair, saying he never meant for things to become complicated, that he respected Emily and valued his marriage, but he couldn't deny that he felt something shift each time he sat across from Margaret, and she responded quietly that she had tried to ignore her feelings out of loyalty to her daughter, yet feelings ignored do not disappear, they simply wait. The honesty in the room felt heavy but strangely relieving, like opening a window in a space that had grown stuffy, and for a brief moment they allowed themselves to acknowledge the truth. They had formed an emotional attachment that was no longer innocent. Margaret's voice softened as she said she never wanted to hurt Emily, that she loved her daughter deeply, and Daniel agreed, guilt tightening his chest because he knew the very conversations they were having would wound Emily if she heard them. Silence followed, not empty but full of awareness, and in that stillness Daniel realized he was standing at a crossroads, one path leading back to his marriage with effort and humility, the other leading into confusion and damage. Margaret rose from her chair and walked toward the window, looking out at the gray sky, saying quietly that sometimes people cling to connection because they fear being alone again, and Daniel understood that she was speaking about both of them. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, and for a brief second he imagined what it would be like to choose this comfort without thinking of consequences, yet the image of Emily's trusting smile flashed in his mind, sharp and clear. He took a slow breath and said they needed boundaries, that what they were building could not continue, that he had allowed emotional distance in his marriage to push him toward the wrong kind of closeness, and Margaret turned toward him with a mixture of sadness and respect, nodding because she knew he was right. Her eyes glistened but she did not cry. Instead she thanked him for being honest before things went further, and Daniel felt both relief and regret wash over him at once. He admitted that the attention and understanding had filled a gap he should have addressed at home, not here, and Margaret agreed that loneliness had made her selfish in ways she hadn't expected. The moment felt final, yet fragile, like glass that could still crack if handled carelessly. Daniel stepped back, creating physical space that symbolized the emotional distance they now needed, and he gathered his jacket, his movements deliberate, steady, determined. Before he left, Margaret said softly that she hoped he would repair what was leaking in his own life the same way he repaired her pipes, with patience and care, and those words stayed with him. As he walked to the door, he felt the weight of what almost happened, not a dramatic affair, not scandal, but something quieter and just as serious, an emotional betrayal built through shared vulnerability. He drove home through cold evening air, hands tied on the steering wheel, understanding that though he had stopped short of physical wrongdoing, he had already stepped beyond the safe boundaries of marriage in his heart. The realization did not feel heroic, only necessary, and by the time he pulled into his driveway, he knew the hardest repair still waited inside his own home, because choosing to step back was only the beginning, and rebuilding trust would require far more courage than fixing any heater or pipe ever had. The truth did not explode into the room with shouting or drama. It arrived quietly on a cold Saturday afternoon when Emily decided to surprise her mother with fresh tulips and a warm apple pie from her favorite bakery, thinking it would be a simple visit filled with smiles. But the moment she stepped through the familiar blue front door and heard low voices in the kitchen, something inside her paused. She had not expected Daniel to be there, and when she saw him standing near the sink with his jacket draped over a chair while Margaret stood a little too close, the scene looked ordinary on the surface yet carried a strange stillness that made Emily's heart tighten. No one was touching, no harsh words were spoken, yet the air felt layered with something unspoken, and Emily sensed it immediately, the way a person senses a storm before rain begins. Daniel's face shifted from calm to startled in a second. Margaret stepped back almost instinctively, and in that small movement Emily saw more than she wanted to see, not betrayal in action, but connection, familiarity, emotional ease that did not belong in that space. She placed the tulips on the counter carefully, her voice steady as she asked what was going on, and Daniel answered quickly that he had come to check a small plumbing concern, his explanation logical yet rushed, and Margaret nodded in agreement, but neither could hide the tension in their expressions. Emily had always trusted her husband and loved her mother deeply, so her mind struggled to process the feeling rising in her chest, yet she could not ignore it. She stayed only a short while, her usual warmth replaced by quiet observation, noticing how easily Daniel and Margaret exchanged glances, how conversation seemed half-finished as if she had entered in the middle of something important. When she finally said she needed to head home, Daniel followed her without hesitation, and the drive back was silent except for the hum of the engine and the faint sound of traffic outside. Emily stared ahead, her thoughts racing, trying to measure what she had seen, and Daniel felt the weight of his choices settle heavily on his shoulders because he knew that even without physical wrongdoing, he had allowed an emotional closeness that crossed lines. Inside their home, the silence stretched until Emily finally asked, calmly but firmly, if there was something he needed to tell her, and in that moment Daniel understood that hiding behind half-truths would only deepen the damage. He took a breath and admitted that he had been visiting Margaret more often than necessary, that their conversations had grown personal, that he had shared feelings about their marriage instead of addressing those feelings directly with her. He made it clear that nothing physical had happened, no secret romance, no hidden affair in the traditional sense, but he did not excuse himself, acknowledging that emotional intimacy outside marriage can hurt just as deeply. Emily listened without interrupting, her eyes filling with tears not of anger but of heartbreak, because what wounded her most was not scandal but the realization that her husband had felt alone and had chosen to speak about it elsewhere. She asked why he hadn't come to her, and Daniel admitted that he had allowed routine and pride to build distance between them, that it had felt easier to talk in a space where he wasn't afraid of disappointing her. Those words were honest yet painful, and Emily turned away briefly, absorbing them. Later that evening she called her mother, and the conversation between them was heavy with emotion, Margaret expressing regret immediately, apologizing for letting loneliness blur her judgment, assuring her daughter that nothing improper had occurred but admitting that boundaries had grown weak. Hearing her mother's voice tremble made Emily understand that this situation was born not from cruelty but from unmet needs and silence. The days that followed were difficult but controlled, no shouting matches, no dramatic exits, only long talks filled with uncomfortable honesty. Daniel suggested counseling, not because he had been caught, but because he wanted to repair what had been quietly breaking between them, and Emily agreed, recognizing that their marriage had been drifting long before that Saturday. In therapy sessions they learned to speak openly about exhaustion, about expectations, about how easy it is for two busy people to become roommates instead of partners, and Daniel took responsibility for seeking comfort in the wrong place. Instead of strengthening the bond at home, meanwhile Margaret stepped back completely, limiting contact, joining a local community group and volunteering at a neighborhood library to rebuild her own sense of purpose without leaning on Daniel's presence. Slowly trust began to mend, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, through small actions, shared dinners without phones, weekend walks, intentional conversations that reached deeper than schedules. Emily did not forget what happened, yet she chose to see it as a wake-up call rather than an ending, and Daniel understood that loyalty is not only about physical faithfulness but also about guarding emotional space. Months later, when winter snow lightly covered the sidewalks, the blue house stood peaceful again, its pipes secure, its rooms filled with healthier boundaries, and Daniel visited only when Emily was with him, their relationship with Margaret respectful and clear. The experience left a lasting lesson in all three hearts. Infidelity does not always announce itself loudly, sometimes it begins quietly through shared loneliness and unspoken needs, and if not faced honestly, it can grow in the silence. But when truth is met with humility and courage, even fragile bonds can be repaired, stronger than before, like pipes carefully sealed to prevent another hidden leak.